Hello and welcome to Prince George Up Close. I'm your host, Grant Bachand, the television show where we talk to this community and the province's movers and shakers. We have a very special guest today, the NDP opposition leader, John Horgan. How are you doing today, sir?
Very good, Grant. Thanks for having me on.
So I'd like to ask you a couple questions, starting off with the election. It's coming up in 17, and we're kind of wondering, where do you guys sit? What's your plan going into 17?
Well, we've been working very hard as an official opposition since the last election to hold the government accountable. That's our responsibility in a British parliamentary system. And also, while we're doing that, talk to people about what they want to see in terms of program delivery, how they're getting by in their communities, what are the moving issues for them, whether it be on the economy, social policy, what programs are being delivered effectively, what programs are not being delivered effectively. Mm-hmm. That's what people do, elected representatives do between elections. Mm-hmm. Now, as you've said, you've foreshadowed that in the next 9 months, we're going to be into the next election. Mm-hmm. That changes the complexion quite a bit. I'm traveling this week. I left Prince Rupert in a Winnebago, hitting campsites along Highway 16, mm-hmm. talking to community leaders, First Nations, business leaders, arriving here in Prince George with my caucus to get together to talk about issues in the north, but also issues right across the province. And that focus now is on what will we be putting forward to the public as our platform in 2017. And
this traveling is a lot to address the housing issue and the affordability issue. Where do you guys say, we hear a lot about Vancouver, we hear a lot about the affordability there, but when we think about it in a northern perspective, it's a little bit different. Where do you guys kind of think about that area?
Well, that's one of the reasons I chose campgrounds, and mm-hmm. one of the reasons that I'm touring the north and the north interior as well as the south interior. I was in Osoyoos, Penticton, Summerland, Vernon, Kelowna, Kamloops, into the Caribou. I've been traveling every part of the province. And the reason I'm doing that, I come from southern Vancouver Island, but the rural part, out the west coast of the island. Mm-hmm. And what my constituents tell me and what I hear outside of the big smoke is, why is it that provincial politics is always about Vancouver? Mm-hmm. Housing affordability there is in crisis, absolute crisis, and all British Columbians are feeling the consequences of that. But the media and even the legislature, we convened this summer for a week-long session to deal with housing in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. We could have started talking about the vacancy rates in Kelowna, in Victoria, in Nanaimo, in the South Interior, where mm-hmm. people are finding a difficult time finding rental accommodation that they can afford. Mm-hmm. But instead, we came together and we talked about Vancouver. Mm-hmm. Important as that is, the big chunk of the population, we need to talk about the rest of the province as well. Yeah. Why I chose a camping tour for the northwest into Prince George, into the center of the province, was because the BC Liberals have increased camping fees by 16%. Mm. They've reduced the number of campsites over the 15 years they've been in power. Supplies going down, costs are going up. Mm-hmm. So it's a microcosm of the argument in the Lower Mainland where supply is constrained and costs are going up. Mm-hmm. And it's not just housing that are challenging people today with affordability. Hydro rates go up year after year after year. In mm-hmm. fact, 74% since 2001, and projected to go up even further in the years ahead. ICBC rates, tuition fees mm-hmm. going up. Medical services premiums going up year after year after year. And while all these government-imposed costs are coming to hit home with people, their wages are staying stagnant. Mm-hmm. Conference Board of Canada and other think tanks, economic think tanks, are showing a real decline in real wages over time, while costs of living keep going up and up. So affordability is the number one issue in every corner of the province, not just in the Lower Mainland.
Do you think that's going to be the issue in the next election?
It's really difficult to determine what will be the issue that captures people's attention during an election campaign. Last election, Christy Clark and the BC Liberals fabricated this notion of 100,000 jobs and a big prosperity fund because of liquefied natural gas. Mm-hmm. They said there would be 3, 4, 5, 6 LNG plants up and running in British Columbia. There are none. Mm-hmm. They had a jobs plan that focused on mining. They said there were going to be 9 new mines. Well, in the time that the government has been in power, the Liberals under Christy Clark, there have been 9 mine closures, not 9 mine openings. And that's on top of of course, the catastrophic disaster at Mount Polley, which of course is now, the mines opened up again, thank goodness for the workers there, but the environmental consequences still not felt are truly understood for all British Columbians. So I think the usual question in an election campaign, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I think uniformly British Columbians will say no.
And when we think about an election, it's been a long time since the NDP have formed a government in British Columbia. Where do you think, how do you think, going into the next election, is that going to be a hindrance, or are you going to have to speak and regain some faith, or do you feel like we're kind of tired of the Liberals and it's something new?
Well, I think it's a mix of that, Grant. I've been elected since 2005. This will be my 4th election campaign, and I represent a community on Vancouver Island. I grew up in resource industries. I worked in a pulp mill, I've worked in a sawmill, I've worked in a joinery. I understand the forest sector pretty well. Critically important here in Prince George and the central part of British Columbia, the interior. So when it comes to forestry, I think I've got a good understanding of the challenges that we're facing. I see raw log exports, I see fall down in annual allowable cut that's coming. It's going to have an impact on workers here and right across the province. I was, for the official opposition, the mining critic and energy critic for a decade before I became leader, so I understand those issues as well. So as a leader of the NDP in northern and resource British Columbia, I think I have a good understanding of the challenges that people face here in Prince George, right through to the coast and right down through the Cariboo. Also, again, the NDP established the Oil and Gas Commission back in the 1990s when we were in government. Paul Ramsey was the Minister of Finance at that time. Dan Miller, famously from Prince Rupert. So we had Prince George and Prince Rupert ministers driving the economy, as you do with Ms. Bond here in Prince George. But I think the time for change has arrived, and I think that people are tired of a government that's lost its way. The Liberals seem to be there for the wealthy and the well-connected, not so much for the working people, and that's historically been the position the NDP has filled in the political spectrum. I came from a working-class family, raised by a single mom. I understand the challenges of getting from paycheck to paycheck as a child and a teenager, and also as an adult raising my own kids. So I believe that I'm well placed to represent the concerns and issues here in Prince George. What the ballot question will be, I think it'll be a variety of things, but I'm going to be making the case as aggressively as I can that change is a good thing, not a bad thing. It shouldn't be feared, it should be embraced. And I know in my own personal life and in my community, if we have systemic problems created over the course of 15 years of BC Liberal rule, perhaps it's time for new eyes. Everyone understands that. Entrepreneurs understand that. If you're having a challenge with a component of your business, sometimes you bring some new eyes in to solve those problems. It's time for new eyes and new ideas in government, I think.
So I want to kind of ask about education now. When we think about education, a lot of young people are suffering under a lot of debt. There's a huge debt load, especially that comes with school. And one of the things, especially here in this community of Prince George, we see institutions having their budgets cut back. CNC is a prime example of this. CNC has continuously had their budget cut back year over year. And we have balanced budgets on one end, but we also have staff losing their jobs and situations in that area. But also, do we take on a larger debt to answer the call of the education crisis, as it would?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Grant, I know on the post-secondary side, we could talk for an hour. On the K-12 side, we could talk for 2 hours, because underfunding in our K-12 system has led to, again, crisis in that system. We've had 2 labor disputes in the time that I've been a member of the legislature. Protracted labor disputes between government and the teachers' union. And that leads to instability, that leads to frustration for parents, that leads to a net drain on our economy. And as you're bringing kids through the K-12 system, you need to prepare them for a modern global economy. And if we're not adequately funding and resourcing the K-12 system, we're shortchanging the next generation of workers, of innovators, of entrepreneurs. And when you take it into the post-sec sector, are we training the right people on the trade side? Are we training enough the appropriate number of welders, of technicians, of computer technologists? Are we training enough philosophers and English majors who are often the critical inquirers who become the most innovative entrepreneurs? I mean, the notion that a liberal arts university does not lead to economic prosperity is just plain wrong. I think most entrepreneurs, if they have an ability to critically inquire, become better entrepreneurs as a result. So as we pile more debt onto the next generation of workers, entrepreneurs, innovators, what are the consequences to the broader economy? And one element that I'm going to focus on, and I'll throw it out here today, and if the Liberals want to steal it, I'm okay with that, because the sooner we get to it, the better. Student loan debt piling up for kids right across, and not just kids, young adults and older adults who have gone back to school to retrain. That debt is becoming debilitating. And the government puts a couple of percentage points on top of what their borrowing costs are. So some would call it loan sharking or shaking down people, but student loan debt has a premium that's paid back to the government to administer those loans. But that, I believe, and certainly student unions across the province and every institution that I've been to, believe that we could reduce the interest rates on student loans that would give some relief, at least a minimum amount of relief, to those young people who have the debt and not have a significant impact on the budgets. Tuition fees have been going up and up and up year after year after year. Services are diminishing, as you say. Cuts at colleges, cuts at universities, increased costs. At some point, I believe that government should recognize that if we're not investing, and it is an investment, it's not a liability when you get skilled people coming out of our K-12 and our post-secondary system. If we're not making the appropriate investments, our competitors are going to pass us. And that'll be a net drag on not just resource communities, but the big urban centers as well.
And I think when you speak with young people, we hear a lot about the environment, climate change as being one of the most important issues that they care about. And this has been a huge topic as well in your own party. The LEAP Manifesto was something that was brought forward, and it was, I think, very controversial, not from within, but also from without of the party. So I know that you've publicly talked about the LEAP Manifesto, but can you tell us a little bit more about your position and where you think it's going to impact the federal and provincial dynamics for the future?
Well, firstly, when I didn't go to the federal convention in Edmonton where the LEAP Manifesto was ratified by the federal NDP. And it was ratified in as much as it was going to lead to another 2 years of discussion. Now, when I joined the NDP, we were policy rich. We continue to be the party of policy. We like to get together to grapple with the challenges of our time, coming up with the right policy direction to lead us into a better tomorrow. And I don't begrudge the good people who worked on the LEAP Manifesto, and I don't even disagree with the bulk of what's in the LEAP Manifesto. What I want, though, as the leader of the BC NDP, is to put forward a platform to the people of this province that we can actually implement, that will see economic growth, we'll see a reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, we'll see innovations that will lead to new energy sources and new energy opportunities for all British Columbians. So transit, a fundamental pillar of the LEAP Manifesto, I absolutely support that in the Lower Mainland, getting people out of cars and building more transit so we can move goods and services around in our metropolitan areas, all good. So when I said, hold on the LEAP Manifesto, what I was saying was, that's fine for the federal NDP and talk about those issues as much as you want. My responsibility as a political leader in British Columbia that has to put forward a viable platform in an election campaign is, I'll put forward my LEAP Manifesto in the next election and people can make their choices there. And why I did that, Grant, is because the BC Liberals, the day after the NDP convention in Edmonton, were saying this is John Horgan's roadmap to disaster. Well, how can you have an intelligent conversation with the public about the needs of the future? Young people in Prince George. I talk to people here. My press secretary is from Prince George. I dragged her out of Prince George to come to Victoria to work with me. Her husband came along with her. We understand the challenges of young people in rural communities. People want to stay in rural communities, but they're dragged away because of a lack of opportunity. So I don't want to have a fight with the BC Liberals about policy questions that someone else is putting forward. I want to have a fight with BC Liberals about the future of British Columbia. And the day after the LEAP Manifesto was ratified, the BC Liberals were in our face right away saying, oh, it's disaster, it's doom and gloom. And I think that's, first of all, doesn't help us meet the challenges of the future when you won't even discuss ideas. And the actual decision in Edmonton was to have a 2-year discussion about those ideas. So I want, put that aside, let the federal party deal with that. I'm going to put forward policies that I believe will excite young people and will prepare us for the future.
Okay, so then thinking about that, looking at pipelines now, pipelines have been certainly something that if you talk to University of Northern British Columbian students, they've been very touchy about that. A lot about Enbridge. Enbridge it looks like it's a project that's kind of off and not going to happen anymore. Kinder Morgan, that was something that in the federal election was brought up, and the pipelines. But Rachel Notley in Alberta wants to see pipelines, and we are kind of we can rather be the access or the blockage to that process. So where do you come in if we were about pipelines and where we need to go from there?
Well, I support Rachel Notley in as much as she wants to see more refined product coming out of Alberta. I think we need to create more jobs in Alberta and in British Columbia and in Canada when it comes to refining these raw materials. But I also believe that our marine environment and our marine economy is critically important to British Columbians. I live on Vancouver Island. I'm surrounded by water, and my constituents are very, very uncomfortable about the prospect of tenfold increases in tanker traffic going through the Strait of Juan de Fuca that I represent. I need to be mindful of that as a local representative, but I also have a larger obligation as the leader of a political party that hopes to become the Premier of British Columbia to make sure that I am giving full weight to every argument that's made when it comes to putting forward these ideas. When I first started working in government, I worked for Mike Harcourt, who was a premier who looked for balance in all things. And I try to emulate Mike in as much as he always used to say, if you pay your taxes, you treat your workers fairly, you protect the environment, we want your investment here in British Columbia. And I've always believed that that's what British Columbians want. When it comes to the oil pipelines, the north and the south, Enbridge and Kinder Morgan, I believe it's not the New Democrats that are opposed to those things. I think British Columbians are opposed to those things. Now, certainly there are building trades members and people in rural communities that can see jobs in the creation of those pipelines. And I'm good with moving products in pipelines. I think it's far superior when it comes to moving oil than it would be to use train cars, for example. My issue, and the issue for most British Columbians, and they live mostly on the coast, is what happens when it gets here? What are your spill responses? What are the consequences to this increase in tanker traffic? Those are the issues that people are grappling with, not just New Democrats, but all British Columbians. So I think that the processes, the National Energy Board processes for the North and the South were inadequate. We made that case as an opposition party. Mr. Trudeau ran for Prime Minister saying the same thing. He's now put in place a new process over top of the NEB when it comes to Kinder Morgan, and then there's another process now emerging because of Supreme Court rulings on Enbridge. So I think the oil pipeline issue will be an issue into the next election and well beyond. What I want to talk about is Christy Clark's commitment to natural gas. Abject failure. Promises that were wildly optimistic. Debt-free BC. Well, our debt's gone up faster in the 4 years that Christy Clark's been Premier than at any time in our history. Every indicator that you can point to about her promises, she's been unable to fulfill them. Those are the issues I think I want to talk about when it comes to energy. And there are so many opportunities now with emerging technologies that will create just as many jobs, in some cases more jobs, if we made those investments rather than going with old school developments.
And one of the areas that I also think is very, very controversial is Site C. You know, Site C, we've heard a lot about it from the Indigenous population who live in the area, and it's going to displace their homes, and you're going to have problems in that way. But we also hear from the BC Liberals and BC Hydro that we need these sort of energy projects going through so that we can have something for the future. But where do you come in when it comes to Site C? Do we need it, or do we something that we can plan in better ways?
Well, BC Hydro, their own annual reports show that we actually had a decline in consumption of energy over the past 10 years. Now, when I say that to people, they go, well, how's that possible? I'm plugging in more stuff in my house than ever before. And electric cars are coming, they're just around the corner. Won't we need more electricity to do that? And intuitively you think, well, of course that makes sense, but the refrigerators of today are not the refrigerators of the 1950s. They're very energy efficient. Light bulbs, very energy efficient. Our cell technology, our cell phones, the old Motorola flip phones of the 1990s used to take a lot of juice to charge up a battery, and you had to do it repeatedly and regularly. The new smartphones, they have better battery technology. They're using less energy. So as much as we're plugging in more stuff, we're actually using less energy in the long term. Every time a mine closes, every time a mill shuts down, industrial load declines. And so we have seen a net decline in industrial consumption and a flat line when it comes to residential and commercial. Your companies that are operating in strip malls and retail operations around BC, their energy's been flat as well. They want to reduce those costs because the prices keep going up. Rates keep going up, so people are using less. That's good news. Site C is a large project as far away from the load center as it could be. And it did not go through the BC Utilities Commission. And why that's important, Grant, is that Bill Bennett, the son of W.A.C. Bennett, the creator of BC Hydro, established the Utilities Commission to protect ratepayers. All of your listeners, all of my constituents depend on BC Hydro to keep the lights on. The Utilities Commission is there to make sure that BC Hydro doesn't make bad decisions driven by politics. And Site C is a bad decision driven by politics. There are a host of other options that we could put in place that would create just as many jobs, not in one place as in Site C, but all around British Columbia that will meet our energy needs now and into the future. The Utilities Commission is the place to go and have that debate. I often say, we're building Site C because Liberals told Liberals that it was a good idea for Liberals to do, but they never put into the equation the rest of British Columbia. And the people of BC are going to be paying for a 9, 10, 11, $12 billion project when it's finally done, which is going to lead to further increases in energy costs for the long term and for energy that we may well not need as climate change emerges and water issues become more challenging. Let's focus on distributive energy. Let's focus on solar, wind, geothermal, a whole host of other options that are available to us that Hydro is foreclosing on because the Liberals insisted that they proceed with Site C.
So would it be a fair assumption to say that if the NDP theoretically were to get elected, Site C might be slowed down, if not stopped altogether?
Well, as I say, I've been the energy spokesperson for the BC NDP for a long time as a member of the legislature. I worked in energy issues when I was a public servant years ago. So I understand the supply and demand as well as anybody, I would think. I'm happy to debate Christy Clark on these issues anywhere, anytime. I invite her on the show, Grant, we can sit right here and I'll talk to her about it all day long. The challenge we have with Site C is the Premier is driving a political agenda. Never a good idea. That's why Bill Bennett created the Utilities Commission, to protect us from ourselves, because it's so appealing to take a public utility and insist that it go down a road that might be politically advantageous to the government. We need to make decisions that are advantageous to the public, not to partisan politicians. So what I will do if I'm successful in May is I will put the question to the Utilities Commission and say, should we continue to proceed with Site C? Are we so far along that it's a better investment to proceed, or is there some way that we can delay this until we need the power potentially 10, 15 years from now? Now, that will disappoint those who are working on the site right now, and it may disappoint suppliers here in Prince George. But there's a whole host of other things that we can and should be doing that we can put these people to work on. First and foremost, revitalizing our forest sector. Every time raw logs leave this province, jobs are going out the door. I want to make sure that we're doing our level best to work with the Council of Forest Industries, forest companies, and forest workers to make sure we're getting every single job we can out of every stick of wood in our forests. We've not been seeing that over the past 15 years. We've been seeing a reduction in jobs and an increase in exports. The mining sector, critically important to our economy. We can't have steel without coal. Metallurgical coal makes the world go round. We have it in abundance here in the southeast, in the Elk Valley, in the Kootenays, and of course in Tumbler Ridge. Now, a downturn in the price of metallurgical coal has led to significant job loss in the Peace Country, and we're maintaining some closures in the Elk Valley because of that coal price. That's going to bounce back. So I think there's a whole bunch of opportunity on the horizon for industrial workers, and I want to make sure that they hear me clearly on that. And we may well continue with Site C if it's the best option, but I want someone other than a BC Liberal to tell me that. I've been, for too long, been disappointed with the rhetoric that comes out of the Liberals. It doesn't translate into good jobs for people in British Columbia. There's no guarantee that the workers at Site C will be from British Columbia. Mr. Bennett said it's up to 75%. Well, that means 25% of the people working there aren't from here. I don't think that's a number that British Columbians will be happy with. First Nations, one last thing on this. They are in court on this question, and the fellow that did the environmental assessment for the federal government on Site C said that the First Nations issues could not be mitigated. That means you can't fix taking away hunting and fishing rights. You just can't fix that. When you flood the valley, you flooded the valley. I believe that the First Nations should get their day in court. I think the province should ask the federal government to accelerate this process and make sure that we have certainty on the land base. We hope to talk about First Nations issues through the interview. Site C is a good opportunity to start right there. Let's address this once and for all when it comes to rights and title in the Peace Country and rights and title right across BC.
And that was my next question, is actually talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and their relation with the Indigenous people of this area. And when we look at it, treaty rights is the big issue in British Columbia. We have a lot of unsettled land. And where do we go? We have Site C, okay, fair, that needs to be dealt with in court. But there's a whole host of other bands and groups that need to be dealt with as well. Where do we go? How do we settle these land disputes?
Yeah, and we've been making progress. And you know, First Nations are so patient. I've been in this tour through the north, and every time I go into the Caribou, I talk to the Silcotin people, and in my community, the Coast Salish people, and in the interior, there's the Shuswap people. Wherever I go into a community, I try and talk to First Nations, Carrie-Sakani, here in Prince George. And the treaty process has stalled. It was put in place in the early part of the 1990s with great hope for First Nations and non-First Nations alike, that we could get that question of certainty on the land base addressed. In rural parts of BC, like Prince George, critically important. Let's figure out once and for all who owns what, what's the roadmap for investors. And every investor I talk to says, just tell me what the rules are, and I will do my level best to follow them. But when there is uncertainty, that leads to economic instability, and investment says, wait a second, I'm not coming. The decisions in the Lower Mainland with respect to housing is going to have an unstabling influence on the housing market there. Put that aside, the Silcotin decision of last June of 2014 made certain in law that there is title to land in British Columbia. That's happening, and we need to build on that. And so the treaty process, the Silcotin decision, and the Site C process allow us an opportunity for once and for all, I believe, to make clear through the reconciliation process, First Nations need to be partners, full partners in industrial economic development. And once we get there, I think investors are good with that. Just tell me what the rules are, and governments need to facilitate that. And I'll do my level best as Premier to make sure that investment comes to British Columbia, First Nations are satisfied, and communities can grow.
And I guess my last question is, what is the message leaving Prince George and in this community Northern that you want them to leave with or understand after listening to you about the future, and especially 2017, and what they can kind of prep themselves for?
When, well, what I try to say, Grant, when a BC Liberal tells you that I don't want you to have a job, they're not telling you the truth. I want people to prosper. I want my community to grow. I got into politics to help my neighbors and make my community stronger. I became leader of the NDP to make British Columbia stronger. We live in a spectacular place with an abundance of resources that are the envy of the world. We have a skilled workforce. We have dynamic communities in the north and the south, and metropolitan areas that are, Vancouver is the top 3 cities in the world year after year after year. This is a spectacular place. And we have a government, we've had a government that tries to pit people against each other. I think it's time that we come together as a community, as a broader community, First Nations, non-First Nations, rural, urban, suburban, and build a dynamic community that everyone can benefit in. For too long, the wealthy and the well-connected have had their way with the BC Liberals. It's time for a government that puts people first and creates opportunity for everybody. That comes through education. That comes through making sure that investors who want to come here know what the rules of engagement are. New Democrats will deliver that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, John. I appreciate you making time to, in your busy schedule, sit down with us.
Enjoyed it a great deal. Thanks very much.
And that's it for the show. Our thanks to John Horgan for taking time out of his busy schedule to sit down and have a conversation with me. Let me know who you want me to talk to next by tweeting me at Grant Bachand. Till next time, thanks for watching.